El-Araj became a much better candidate because it has a Roman layer and it is on the lake.
To have a basilica traditionally built over the house of Peter and under the apse to find the walls of first century homes, again, that's about as far as you can push it.
When you have a handful of Roman period pottery that you can clearly identify, it means something.
So it reaches its zenith and size and prominence right at the time that things are declining at Tel, which was for me a bit of a disconnect.
Welcome to Truth and Tradition. In this episode, I'm speaking with two leading scholars who have been unearthing a lost village on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. Dr. Stephen Notley is a notable historical geographer with a background in comparative religious studies, and Dr. Mordechai Aviam is an experienced archaeologist of the Holy Land. Since 2016, they've been excavating the site of El-Araj, a candidate for the biblical village of Bethsaida, a village that held the feeding of the 5,000, the healing of a blind man, and even the childhood home of the apostles Peter and Andrew. This conversation comes in light of my recent interview with Dr. RAMI, who advocates for a different location for Bethsaida. You can check out that conversation by clicking here, or for my audio-only listeners, in the show notes down below. But today we explore the other side of the debate, the compelling case for El-Araj as Bethsaida. Welcome, Moti and Stephen. Thank you for joining me here on the podcast.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
My first question for you guys is, what got you guys interested in El-Araj? What sort of things drew you to it, and what was the process of starting to excavate back in 2016 like?
You want me to start, Moti?
Of course. It started with you.
Well, not really, but it has a long history. As you know, the identifying lost biblical sites is it's not limited to our site. Most biblical sites were lost in time. So we've been in a period of rediscovery over the last 150 years when travel became more available coming here and people began to travel the country and looking at the identification of the sites. There's certain principles for site identification. If they match generally the description of historical sources, the names, oftentimes the Hebrew name from Scripture is, in sites from the Hebrew Bible are remembered in Arabic. So there's toponymy comes into play. And then the last thing really is archaeology. If you excavate a site, and there has been, there's testimony about settlement or destruction, something of that nature that's described, and you excavate and you don't find evidence of what is described, then either your conclusion is that the sources were wrong or you're excavating in the wrong place. And again, we're not just talking about our place, we're talking in general. In the middle of the 19th century, one of the sites that people were looking for, that came across was considering Bethsaida, which is the home of Peter, Andrew, and Philip, according to John's gospel. There were various ideas put forward. Two prominent sites is at Tel, where Rami Arav has been excavating, and then El-Araj. The Robinson was one of the first who sort of, committed himself to at Tel. And there wasn't really much question about it until Gottlieb Schumacher, about 50 years later, and he came along and made the observation that Tel is too far away from the lake to be a fishing village, which is how it's described in all the sources. Josephus, the New Testament, all lend themselves that it's on the lake shore. It's a fishing village, and that it being 3 kilometers, a mile and a half away from the lake shore, is not logical. So Schumacher, I think Rami got them switched in his presentation. Schumacher actually suggested that Bethsaida was at El-Araj, and Bethsaida is later made into a small Jewish polis called Julius. and he suggested that El-Araj was Bethsaida and Et-Tel was Julius. Rami was correct, though, that approach doesn't work because Josephus's description has them on the same site, not at two different sites. So, so already in the 1880s, El-Araj is being suggested mainly from surface remains, capitals, things like that were on the ground, suggesting that it was Bethsaida, first century Bethsaida. No archaeology was done there really of any serious intent until we began in 2016. My study is as a historian. I'm always very open and clear. I'm not trained in archaeology. I've dug a bit. I know how to move dirt. Moti always likes the fact that I get in and get covered from head to toe from dirt and sweat. But
you get yourself dirty. Down in the dirt.
as I told him, I didn't come 7,000 miles to watch. But I got in. I'm trained as an historian, New Testament studies, Gospel studies. I studied with David Flusser at the Hebrew University. But one of the things you learn very quickly when you study history in the land of Israel is that you have to engage concrete realities. Sometimes our theories don't match what we find physically there, and it requires us to adjust. It's a long story, but basically, slowly, I got drawn into historical geography, which is how I would generally describe myself. And historical geography deals with history, geography, toponymy, place names, and archaeology. And so that it's a multidisciplinary approach, and got involved with a man named Ensign Rainey, who was a renowned historical geographer, and he got me into publishing. And when you start writing, you don't just have ideas, but you actually publish. You have to think more seriously about your ideas because you open yourself up. But one of the places that was still a question mark was the site of Bethsaida. And Rami had been digging from 1987. And in the early 2000s, I began to address that and sort of raise some questions about it, and published. And Rami made reference to it and sort of raised the questions two things that left me with questions. One is its distance from the lake. And the second is that the remains of the excavation, or at that time, 15, almost 20 years, the archaeological remains didn't seem to match what we would expect to find. The site was sort of in a decline at the same time that Josephus speaks about it being transformed into a polis. So it reaches its zenith in size and prominence right at the time that things are declining at Tel, which was for me a bit of a disconnect. Again, I began to raise questions. One of my former students helped organize a survey and with Rami. He actually knew Rami before I did. I mean, not Rami, Moti. He knew Moti before I did. And they organized this survey in 2014 and just to see what's there. And Moti can talk a little bit more about what's involved in the survey. But the idea was to test it to see if the profile of the site that comes out of a survey, whether it more or less made itself a possible site that, to identify as a possible site. It doesn't prove it, but it opens the door. If you don't find any evidence of settlement in a particular period that the historical sources are speaking about, then why dig? And the results of the survey were promising. Again, didn't prove anything, but it opened the door for beginning of excavations in 2016. I sort of was just another person digging in the square, but I had already written, and so I had to be there because I wanted to see whether these ideas were, whether it was a possible site. I might add that my earlier writing that was made reference to was more of a question of Et-Tel than advocating El-Araj. El-Araj remained a possibility, but you can't prove it without archaeology, and no one had excavated. So my early writing was only raising the questions and pointing out the deficiencies and identifying tell. We didn't set out to prove anything. We set out to excavate and see where the evidence led us. And certainly Moti wasn't setting out to prove anything in the excavation. We were just excavating, and you let the evidence lead you where it leads you. And we could have just as easily come up short. But I would have to say we were pleasantly surprised by the results. So, Moti, you want to jump in? Anything else to add to that?
I was not deep in the question of where is Bethsaida. As a Galilean archaeologist, I visited RAMI almost every season. He worked at El, came to see what's there, got explanations. And like many, many other people in the world, I agree that this is a Bethsaida because this was the only one which was excavated and yielded first century results. I never asked questions because I was not in the point where I was interested in the historical geographical history questions. Until Stephen and his student Mark came to me, as a matter of Mark, and after that Stephen, I said, "Are you interested in making archaeological excavations at El-Araj?" I learned that there are debates, and I knew everything about what Rami suggested. I knew almost nothing about other suggestions. I heard it. I said, it's interesting. And we have, in archaeology, we have a method. Don't come and bring the bulldozers and dig immediately and get the answers after the first 2 days. I said, first thing we have to do before getting into deep digging is to do what we call shovel testing. Shovel testing is a process in which your volunteers or workers are digging many squares. A square is 5 by 5 meter, but not deep, only 20 centimeters, which is what we call in archaeology the surface layer. What you get out of it is, of course, much more pottery than in a survey. Survey is only what's on the ground. On the ground, you get 20, 30, 50 pottery. If you dig 20 centimeters, you get much more. And that's what we did. We did 15 squares. And we came out after 3-4 days with a handful of Roman period pottery. I was surprised, not totally, but I was surprised because other scholars, a friend of mine, found there 1 or 2 Roman pottery, but one swallow doesn't bring the spring. So, but when you have a handful of Roman period pottery that you can clearly identify, it means something. I asked Rami what he think about it, and he said, "I assume they were eroded from Etel, it's downstream." Okay, so it was eroded from his site, and I asked him, "So your site is basically Iron Age, so why not Iron Age pottery where can be found in El-Araj, only Roman?" No answer. That was not yet a debate, but it was interesting. And because of that interest, I told Stephen that I'm ready to go for a dig. That's what happened. The first layer was not even clear to me when we started, only when we surveyed. Only while digging, the first layer came out to be a Crusader period sugar factory.
Yeah.
It was interesting by itself. And when we dug for the first season some rooms of the sugar factory, we realized that the Crusader walls were built over earlier walls, which were clearly identified as Byzantine period. And as I excavated some 15 churches in Western Galilee, I had a lot of experience with churches. I told Stephen, I think that we might find here a church. But that was the first season. Second season, we continued. We cleared more from the Crusader level. And here we also have to mention the visit of a German priest who came to visit the site in the beginning of the 20th century. A Syrian guy who lived there. He was not at home, but the manager told him, come and see what we found. And in his memories, what's his name? Stephen de Haas, Rudolf de Haas.
Rudolf de Haas, yeah.
In his memoirs, he says, they showed me in the depth of 2 meters, they showed me a beautiful, colorful Roman mosaic floor. So that was the first hint where to start to dig. Then we started and found the Crusader. But then we found evidence for a church and then suspected that the mosaic he saw is not Roman but Byzantine. And the second season we hit a mosaic floor, suggesting very strongly that we are within a Byzantine period church. Not only a church, but rooms around it, which suggested that there is a monastery around it. And we found 2 or 3 rooms that were paved with basalt tiles, floor tiles. And for us as archaeologists, it means that it's a sealed locus. What below it will be very clear, sealed, and clearly identified. So we decided to make a probe, to take out some of these tiles. And we discovered that below them there are a lot of 5th century coins that tell us that the church and the monastery were built in the 5th century. But we wanted to see if there is something deeper, because Roman period pottery from the survey, from the shovel testing, should come from a deeper layer. So we started digging in the same probe, deeper and deeper and deeper. It was all empty soil.
Silt.
Yeah, came with the rivers from the north and covered the entire area, but there were little pieces of pottery. So for me as an archaeologist, it means that this is not virgin soil. We should go deeper. More than 1.5 meters below the Byzantine floors, we hit a clear, full, rich Roman layer. Very rich. Pottery, coins, glass, bricks, mosaics. It's all a layer of destruction, but it's only Roman, 1.5 meters. At that point, we should mention that RAMI was a good scholar. When he said that Etel is the right place, he said if other scholars think that El-Araj is another candidate, I will go and check El-Araj. So in 1987, he did a probe at El-Araj. He said only a few sentences about it. He says that he found only Byzantine walls and floors. He dug below the floor. It was all virgin soil, and therefore it proves that Etel is the right place in the Roman period, while El-Araj was built only in the Byzantine period. In the second season, we proved that El-Araj is dated to the Roman period as well. It was just because he didn't go 1.5 meters below. That's all. That's the reason. El-Araj became a much better candidate because it has a Roman layer and it is on the lake. That was the beginning. Again, as I had a lot of experience with churches, I told Stephen churches like this should have inscriptions on the floor, on the mosaic floor, and therefore we should check specific places that I know that regularly they have inscriptions. And we found an inscription. Sadly, it was damaged by the Crusader wall and was cut right in the spot where the important information is. The upper part says, our glorious bishop, blah, 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 made the renovation of the church, and then it's gone. Which church, what time, gone.
Which bishop, yeah.
We were disappointed. Then we found another piece of inscription, which was probably a very large one, but only 20 centimeters were left, also speaking about renovation. But 2 years later, we in one of the side rooms beside the apse, we found an inscription which not even one tessera is missing. A complete medallion with about 15 lines in Greek. And this inscription tells us that the church was dedicated to the keeper of the keys.
Yeah, it's beautiful inscription. Honestly, I've seen definitely like video and footage of it, and
it doesn't mean
it's clear.
When
it's
we
really
found
cool.
it and decipher it, it didn't mean that this proves that this is Bethsaida of the first century, because a church dedicated to Peter, remembering Bethsaida, should be 2 kilometers away. It doesn't prove. But together with the Roman remains, now we have a Byzantine period inscription that tells us that it's dedicated to Peter, and we have 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries below it. But to the east, we discovered, open 2 squares. We hit Byzantine and Roman layers below it. To the north, about 80 meters to the north, 100 meters to the north, we hit Roman layer just below surface. No Byzantine, no Crusader. Everything is Roman. Then we head to the west, and we discovered 30 centimeters below surface, only Roman. There are Roman houses, private dwellings everywhere we dug. But in the first probe we did, in the second season, then we found many evidence of a Roman public bathhouse. It means thick layer of cement with mosaic on them, thick layers of fresco, bricks, and especially what we call tubuli, which are the hollow bricks of Roman bath. In the walls that takes the heat up and to the walls. These bricks, we don't have one. We have many. All these bricks prove that we have here a public structure. Public structure, a bathhouse with frescoes and mosaic, did not exist in small villages in the Roman period, not in Israel, maybe only in beautiful villas in Italy and Britain and England. But we don't know. There are small bathhouses in very few villages, but not something as fancy as this one. This was a hint that supported our suggestion that this is Bethsaida, a village which transferred into Julias, a small Jewish polis in the later 1st century.
Yeah, I thank you for walking us through all of that. I think it's really important to kind of see the process of what brought you guys into this topic and some of the findings chronologically. And there are a few things I am curious to hear your thoughts on. But the first thing that kind of stuck out to me is actually with your first sort of scoping in the area. You mentioned that you found a few centimeters basically on the surface level Roman era pottery. Now I know that this kind of stratum, this layer, is generally thought to be from the Ottoman Empire period. So I'm curious as to why you think you would have found Roman era pottery. Is that kind of a common thing to find, older artifacts on higher levels?
That's very, very, it's a basic. Every first year of BA student in every department of archaeology is to know that on surface you'll find most of the periods that exist at the site. And that's because in the Crusader period, they came and started to build a sugar factory. They dug down for foundation for their walls. They got into the Byzantine period, down to the Roman period, took out soil, put it away, built their houses. Now we have Byzantine and Roman layer up here in the Crusader period. The same happened with the Ottoman period. This guy tells us that in the 20th century, they dug down to the Byzantine floor. Then pottery from the Byzantine period is up. So this is a basic rule in every archaeological site. Not all, but you have most of. That's what we do in a survey. We collect the pottery on surface, analyze them, and said, okay, this site have Ottoman, Byzantine, Crusader, Byzantine, and Roman according to the pottery found on surface. Shovel testing brings us more information, but it's exactly the same.
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. That makes sense. The kind of other thought, so you mentioned the idea of finding a lot of silt, but then when you dig further, you then start to find Roman era artifacts like the coin to Nero, I believe. And then there was like a 2nd century bronze coin. You also find the bathhouse, as you mentioned. I know that Rami mentioned that all of these artifacts and these structures that you found, they date back as early as the second half of the 1st century, which would have still been after the time of, the disciples. What do you have to say about that kind of thought?
I invited Rami to visit. He came last year, I think, the first visit he came last year. And I showed him and I explained to him, we have 3rd century CE, 2nd century CE, 1st century CE, 1st century BC. All pottery going down probably as the end of the 2nd century BC to the Hasmonean period. That's what we have at the very bottom now. We have everything from 1st, 2nd century BCE to the 3rd century when the site was abandoned.
So what 2nd century BCE material do you have?
The 2nd century BCE is just a very small probe, but maybe we have also from there, we have already weights, fishing weights. But in the 1st century, only in one square last year, only in one square in the 1st, 2nd century, we have more than 50 fishing weights from one place, one spot.
Wow.
So we have today like 500 fishing weights in our excavations. That's a fishing village, no doubt. Now we have coins, not only coin, but we have coins from the Hasmoneans in the 1st century, not only Nero, we have many coins of the 1st century. We have Jewish coins of the 1st century. We have coins of Herod Philip. Our site, as we know now, started in the Hasmonean period, like many other Jewish villages in the Galilee.
Now, this is it. The profile actually fits what we know of the Galilee of that period. And here we're in the Lower Golan, but the same is that you have a development settlement in the Hasmonean period, and it matches. As he said, there are coins, pottery, glass, everything matches the development of the site, probably towards the end of the 2nd century BCE, and it continues right on up until it was abandoned, probably in the 3rd century CE. The idea that we don't have anything before 50 CE is that's just ridiculous. We have lots of things. Again, pottery, glass, coins that demonstrate a continuity of settlement in the period.
Rami suggested after he used the research of geologists from Haifa University, he suggested that there was a big lagoon stretching from the lake towards a tail. That explains why it was on the shore, but not on the shore. It was on the shore of the lagoon. Let's explain him why they were of a fishing village and they were on the lake. But if at the same period there is a big site on the lake shore, it is impossible because these Jews were living under 1.5 meters of water, and even Jews are using to breathe. So it's not working. It's not. There was no lagoon. If there was no lagoon, Ethel was on the land, 2.5 kilometers from the shore.
It's one of the fundamental problems in the beginning. It's not just the distance from the lake, but in the article that I published on it, that again sort of stirred the pot a bit, I pointed out that the elevation of what he called the dock stones, the harbor, is 7 meters higher than the known 1st century level of the lake. If the water reached to that point, every known settlement around the lake, Capernaum, Tiberias, Magdala, are all underwater. The problem is that people who are reading this are reading it from abroad, and it's words on a page, and they don't connect it with the sort of the three-dimensional reality of being on the ground. And as Moti says, if that's true, the settlement that we've discovered at El-Araj, they're underwater. That's just long before they've invented snorkels or anything of that nature. So it doesn't fit. It doesn't work.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And definitely, as I was looking into this, that was one of the things I was curious about the theory with et tel. Doesn't really make sense, especially with Capernaum and these other settlements that we have. I know Rami suggests the idea of like climate change contributing to the shoreline, shifting, and then later in I believe the 4th century, an earthquake shifting it up again. But I mean, when we look at El-Araj, we do see the settlement there, and it seems to be more than what he suggests to be a military base. It seems to be more than that. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit? Why would El-Araj maybe not be this Roman mercenary military base? What do you have to suggest that it might be a little bit more than that?
First of all, armies of Herod of Agrippa, that's a small army. They don't build huge camps like a Roman legion. Second, the rooms that we found are regular buildings, houses of human beings, with cooking pots, with taboons, with cooking ovens, with a hoard of coins, glass vessel. Nothing about weapons, nothing about army. But nevertheless, the question is even earlier. This was in the military camp, it can be underwater in any way. If they are soldiers or citizens, they can't live underwater. There is no evidence, literary evidence, for any built camp, that the fact that the soldiers arrived there and maybe put some tents for 2-3 days, that's not a military camp. That's not what we found. What we found is clearly a Jewish settlement, like many, many others known from all around the lake and the Galilee.
Can I jump in and add?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it needs to be underscored as well, as that what was found is evidence of Jewish settlement. These are, in other words, they're stone vessels used by observant people who are living there. The other thing is, if I'm not mistaken, we don't really have evidence. He always suggests that the bathhouse belonged to the Roman camp. I don't think we have evidence of that in the land of Israel. I don't think in that period, we really don't find them building. I don't know. Correct me, Moti.
I don't know. No, I'm pretty sure that a legionary camp, like Legio or like Tel Shalem near Bet She'an, would have a bathhouse. We know that the Roman legionaries were producing tiles for bathhouses in Jerusalem. But what we have here is a very massive and decorated, which doesn't go very well with a small army camp of Agrippa. Right? It's not the case.
That makes sense, yeah.
From a historical standpoint, I will say that Josephus describes in the fighting between the mercenaries and the Jewish forces that reserves came from Magdala, from Tarikia, came across and landed there at Bethsaida. So it doesn't make sense if that is a site of a Roman camp. It's not the place that the reinforcements are going to land. None of it fits. the idea that the site of El-Araj is a Roman camp. Doesn't fit history, doesn't fit archaeology. It doesn't work.
Sorry, with the you. I guess trying to understand the last point, you said in the writings of Josephus, it refers to it being in a different place, or I guess what do you mean by that?
No, he's in his descriptions of the fighting. He comes out on the plain. Josephus is there. He's on a horse. It falls. He gets injured, and they remove him and take him back to Capernaum, and away from the danger. And the next day, he says that reserves came. Reinforcements came by boat, and they came to Bethsaida, and that doesn't make any sense that they would arrive to the area. Then it would be called Julius, that they are arriving in Julius. If there's a Roman camp there, it doesn't make any sense that they would come there. That's where the point of arrival, to come reinforce the Jewish forces, if there's a Roman camp there on site. It doesn't, none of it works, none of it fits. It doesn't seem that Julius is involved at all in the conflict, that it's not part of, we don't find any evidence of fighting, of violence there. It doesn't, neither in the historical sources nor in the archaeology, it doesn't seem to be participating in the fighting with the mercenaries.
In any case, the fights there were only for a few days. I don't think that in a few days they built a camp and a bathhouse. Again, I'm speaking here about building project. Build a camp of this size with a bathhouse. That's an issue, even for the Roman army, for at least a year. That's not the case.
Yeah, that makes sense. And in my talk with him, one of the things, even in the interview, I realized was not necessarily correct. He mentioned that there was only a pipe basically found, just like referring to like the ventilation for the bathhouse, and that was the only thing found. He didn't like directly say that, but I like asked a qualifying question, and there was no like clarification. Which is not true, because like you said, there's like a mosaic flooring, and it makes it seem less like a, scrambled together like bathhouse for the military camp, but more like a place that's, well-established, beautiful settlement area for this era.
Yeah, I told Rami that we have a lot of bricks, which is very typical to Roman bath. A lot of tubuli as ventilation pipes. A lot of pieces of fresco, a lot of pieces of marble. You don't build it in a week with soldiers. It doesn't work. This is a public bathhouse of a small city, a small polis. Big ones you can see in the big cities, in Beit-Shan, Scythopolis, at Bet Guvrin, Caesarea. We know them. But this one is, I assume, is a public bathhouse, beautifully decorated marble that should be brought from a distance. And thick layers of cement with mosaic on them is typical to the floors of bathhouses. And the ventilation pipes, the tubuli, it's very clear. We don't have one, we have many.
So I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit. So this location wasn't excavated until 2016. But Stephen, you were writing about this from the early 2000s. It was also in the literature since I think end of the 19th century and then beginning of the 20th century. So this location was talked about for a very long period of time. So I'm curious as to why it didn't get excavated until 2016. Was there maybe geological difficulties with that, or maybe danger in the area? I'm just curious as to why.
First of all, archaeology only begins right at the end of the beginning of the 20th century. So nobody's digging until Flinders Petrie and the whole development of archaeological process And then the area where we are was privately owned. There was an aristocrat who lived there, had a large villa, and he owned the lands around there. They were agricultural lands. And so, as Moti mentioned, the only thing that we have is this sort of serendipitous moment where a German Lutheran pastor came to visit. The owner was away, but they were doing repairs, and had dug down and found 2 meters and found a mosaic. They didn't know what to do with it, so they covered it back up, and that was it. Nothing else was done. And then in 1948, of course, it was the area was under Syrian control. It is in the what would you call it, the armistice boundary area, but it was occupied by Syrian troops, and so it was in Syria until 1967. And since 1967, there really wasn't any efforts made to excavate. There were some surveys were done, but no excavations were done. And until RAMI started excavating, up at El-Araj. Now it's I don't know when it was founded, but we're in the area of a nature reserve. So it can't be developed. I mean, there's limitations in terms of what you can do, not only from the license, from the permit, from the IAA, but also just in general. We find scorpions or serpents or anything, we can't kill them, but we have to capture them and let them loose someplace else away from us.
Interesting.
It's a very secluded area, and let's be honest, it takes money. This is a privately funded excavation, and we have to find funding to do it. It doesn't come from the state. Not everybody's interested in doing such things.
Yeah.
It's much less expensive to write about them, which is what I did. I could throw my ideas out there, publish them, and stir the pot and raise questions. And again,
he was sitting in the library. He was sitting in the library where it's air conditioned, but now he's digging 40 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, that's right. It's hot. And again, I have to. Sometimes people misunderstand that my early writing was only raising questions about El-Araj.
Yeah,
it wasn't. I wasn't like majorly advocating for El-Araj. All I did with El-Araj was point out that we had a lot of surface remains, and it was worth someone looking at. That was it. And you can't demonstrate there's anything there or not until you excavate. And that's really the only purpose of our excavation, is to see, is there anything there or not? And you allow the evidence to answer that question.
After the beginning of archaeology, in the beginning of the 20th century, people were digging mainly in biblical tales, searching for the big cities of the Bible, or in places where you see something on the ground. For example, the reason to dig Capernaum by the British and then the Germans was because there was a huge heap of beautiful cut stones with decorations. At El-Araj, there was almost nothing. So right. no one was interested in going dig there. That's all.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess if you have like a beautiful architecture remains just kind of sticking out of the ground, it's pretty noticeable. Whereas not too much with El-Araj until you start digging. So right. I think the highlight, at least from as I was looking into El-Araj, is the inscription found at the Byzantine church. Can you guys maybe describe a little bit about this church and the three inscriptions that were found there?
First of all, it was a surprise. No one knew why if there is any church in the area. Stephen will go following me on the story of Willibald, the Christian visitor. When I realized that we are going to dig a church, I asked Stephen how it comes that there are Christian visitors around the Sea of Galilee speaking about churches in Tabgha, in Capernaum, in Kursi, and there is nothing about any church here. He couldn't answer, but he said, I will go and check. And this is how we found Willibald. We found an unknown church, an important one. In its first stage, I assume it was a beautiful, rich church that included also gilded glass tessera, the mosaics. We have some very poor remains of beautiful chancel screens made of marble. In the second stage, the renovations were probably made it very poor. I can't explain it yet. Maybe when we finish the excavations and under research, we can try and find what happened to the church and when. In any case, the church was standing there until the 8th century, as you will hear from Stephen.
We weren't expecting to find a church. And when, Moti asked me, my area is certainly not Byzantine history. So I'm all the time having to go back to my library and pull out things and try to fill in the blanks. And so he asked me about it, and I went and found this pilgrimage. I have collections of pilgrimages, and this Bavarian bishop in the 8th century went traveling around the lake, and he speaks about coming to Bethsaida and finding a church built over the house of Peter and Andrew. A number of people believed that the church he was talking about was not at El-Araj, but was at Capernaum, because they had a church in Capernaum. So they just said, he was confused. He didn't know where he was. He was actually talking about the church at Capernaum. And so, and in fact, when we first put forward the idea that this was the church of Willibald, and Moti sent off to a colleague of his, pushed back and said, no, Willibald was confused. He was actually Capernaum. And so Moti asked me, he says, this is a serious scholar. And I go, I said, even serious scholars make mistakes. And I said, you have evidence right in your hand. You have the tessera there. You have something they don't have. They're dealing in just the historical story. And as we dug more and more, we should say it's not just a church, it's a basilica. It's not a small chapel. It's a sizable church. And I think it's
Can you define that real quick, basilica?
Moti?
Basilica is a type of church that has, it's an elongated building, usually entrances to the west, a large apse or 3 apses to the east, 2 rows of columns divided to a main hall, and the nave, and 2 aisles on both sides. That's a basilica. It came from the Roman world, from the Roman basilica, civil basilicas, and became a place of worshipping from the 4th century. The 4th century is at the time that the basilicas were transferred from a civil structure to be a place of worship in the Christian religion.
So specifically, like a Roman church, you mentioned an apse. That's like the specific. It's like a half circular kind of structure.
Yeah, it's a rounded niche facing to the east.
Facing east, and in the center of it stands the altar.
So it's a important place. Clearly it's not just like a thrown together.
No.
It's a Roman era, very important. Okay.
In the Roman era, the basilica is civil. It's a place of gathering, a place of trials. But in the Byzantine period, when Christianity took over, there was a kind of search. What type of big building will be good for a church? The temple, not good, because people are outside. So basilica is a place where you enter it. So they took the basilica and made it what we call the Christian basilica.
And the importance of it is underscored by the finding of the inscription. Moti made reference to it, the medallion inscription, and which it's a reference to the donor who helped to finance the redoing of the floor, the retiling of the floor, and then it makes it in the middle of it. It then makes reference. It seeks prayer, intercession from, and it calls him the chief of the apostles and the keeper of the keys of heaven, to a Christian community, a Christian reader, can be only one person, and that is Peter. And so even those who questioned that this was a church referenced by Willibald built over the house of Peter, as soon as the inscription was found, they said, okay, that's it. This is the church of Willibald, and it traditionally marks the place of Peter's home. As Moti says, that doesn't prove anything. It can, it gives a stronger argument that we're in, at least in Christian tradition, Byzantine Christian tradition, we're in Bethsaida, because that's where, according to John's gospel, he lived. Because I asked Moti, I said, if we have a church and usually the apse is the area of the most sacred area of the church. And I said, if this is the most sacred area of the church, that usually there's relics and things like that mark the identification of the church. And if this church is only known as church built over the house of Peter, there should be first century houses underneath the apse. And so we carefully preserved the mosaics of the apse and dug down and found a series of walls, second, third century, but also first century walls there, which again, it doesn't prove, but it's about as strong evidence as you could hope for. I mean, unless you find a plaque that says Peter slept here, that's, that you can't, you're not going to be looking for an inscription, but to have a basilica traditionally built over the house of Peter and under the apse to find the walls of first century homes is that again, that's about as far as you can push it. So
yeah, that's pretty significant.
Okay, there were other Jewish villages all over. But if we have on the shore, first of all, on the shore, second, a Christian basilica that is mentioned in historical source as the house of Peter, built over the house of Peter and Andrew. And we have an inscription mentioned Peter. And below it, we have 3rd, 2nd, 1st century houses. And we have Roman period houses all over. I think that it's almost no doubt that this is the best candidate.
Might want to add that churches that are associated with Peter in the Byzantine period are very rare in the land of Israel. And usually they appear in places where Peter shows up in the Gospels. In other words, some action like St. Peter in Gilicantu in Jerusalem that remembers his denying of the Lord. So it's usually a fairly rare occasion to find a church that's associated with Peter. And there's only one reason you would build a church and have it associated with Peter where we're excavating. And that's because of the belief that we're in Bethsaida, based on John 1:44, that it being the home of Peter, Andrew, and Philip.
I was curious when I looked into the specific quote of the inscription. I'll read it here real quick. It says, and this is the English translation from your guys' publication, I believe. It says, the whole work of paving the diaconicon with mosaic was done by the zeal of Constantine, servant of Christ, chief of the apostles, and holder of the keys of the heavenly spheres. Intercede for him and for his children, George and Theophano. And so there, like you mentioned, Stephen, it has specifically a reference to the church paver. It's not Emperor Constantine, but it's the church paver, Constantine. Right. And then it sort of, at least my understanding, has an intercessory sort of prayer over Constantine and his two children, referring to probably St. Peter, chief of the apostles and holder of the keys to the heavenly spheres. These seem to be very clear. He's talking about Peter here. My question, though, is based on that inscription, to me, it doesn't really seem like the church is necessarily being dedicated to Peter here, but it seems like it's more of a dedication, maybe even to the paver Constantine, referencing Peter. So I'm curious, from a historical perspective, am I missing something here? Is this quote maybe dedicating to Peter? I guess I'm confused on that.
No, it's part of Catholic tradition, the intercession of the saints. In other words, it's asking prayer on behalf of someone to a saint. Again, this is part of the Catholic tradition of the intercession of the saints. But why not another saint? Why Peter? Why Peter here? He could have picked any other saint, but to select Peter, his intercession, for on behalf of Constantine. I mean, can it be a coincidence? Sure, it could be a coincidence, but it's when you start adding it all up, it's you have a series of, plus you have the Byzantine tradition that this is a house built over don't forget Willibald. Let's not leave him to the side.
Yeah.
This is a tradition that it's built over the house of St. Peter. I would argue actually that, and I've written it, I actually think that tradition goes back before Willibald. I think that we already hear it in the 6th century from the anonymous pilgrim from Piacenza, who speaks about a basilica, and speaks specifically about a basilica over the house of Peter. So I actually think the tradition goes back even before Willibald, and
what is that? You said Piacenza, the anonymous pilgrim. What is that date to?
In the middle of the 6th century, 500. Okay. We have a pilgrim who comes, we don't know the name, that comes from Piacenza in Italy. And he once again describes pilgrimage coming around the lake and speaks of, he comes to Capernaum and then to a basilica built over the house of Peter. The only basilica in the vicinity is our basilica. There's no basilica in Capernaum. There's no Capernaum beyond us unless you go all the way around to Corsi. But it's not Corsi. And so once again, you have this repetition of tradition of Peter's house being commemorated and remembering there. It seems to lend itself, at least in my reading of it, that it's that you have this long-standing tradition. Again, I want to be very clear. We deal in a scientific manner. If you ask me, am I absolutely certain that Peter's house, and I would say no, you can't, unless I find a plaque that says Peter slept here, some inscription like that. But you have a continuity of Christian memory that is being passed down. And you have Eusebius, who's the last voice of the Roman period in his Onomasticon, writing in 305. And he's remembering Bethsaida for one thing. Bethsaida shows up several times in the Gospels, but he remembers it as being the house of Peter, the place of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. So it's you have this continuity of tradition, of memory. And I think that's sometimes something we miss in the West. We think that we dismiss oral memories in the East, and memories in the East are very, very long. Traditions are very long. In an article I wrote, I pointed out that we have the Damascus Gate is called in Arabic Bab al-Amud, which is the gate of the column. And that name remembers a column that hasn't stood for 1,500 years. So we're still calling it by the name of a column put up by Hadrian in the 2nd century, and continued during the Byzantine era, but it's been gone for 1,500 years. So we shouldn't quickly dismiss the memories that we have here. We should listen to them very carefully. Josephus's accounts were often dismissed and thrown aside as being fanciful and fictional until archaeology came along, and they began to find in archaeology, hey, his physical descriptions are spot on. So suddenly historians had to step back and say, well, how can he be describing things physically and be so wrong with his historical elements? Now, it doesn't mean that everything he writes is inerrant or without mistakes, but it means we should at least listen very carefully to these oral traditions and not dismiss them in the first go. We use scientific method. We raise questions. We kick the tires, but we should listen more carefully. And I think in this instance, we have a continuity of tradition that keeps being reinforced by the archaeology. If someone wants to just, ignore it or dismiss it, they can. But I tend to sort of, unless I find another basilica around in our region, I think this is the best candidate. And that's usually the language we speak. We speak of our site being the best candidate. I would want to say one more thing, just because I know it was part of the previous program. A statement was made because there's a problem not a problem. There's a disagreement with the John's Gospel describes Bethsaida of Galilee, and this has always posed a problem because we're not in Galilee. We're in the Lower Golan, which is where Josephus describes it. And so for years, people were looking for a second Bethsaida. They were, they're looking at various places, that there were two Bethsaidas, one in Galilee, one in the Lower Golan. People were trying, and in the program, it was suggested that somehow I had thought that the Jordan changed its course and at one time ran on the other side of El-Araj in order to make our site agree with Bethsaida of Galilee. I've never heard of such a thing. I've never thought of such a thing. It's absolute lunacy. No one would think such a thing. The course of the Jordan has changed since 1969. At least the outlet has changed, but that's a modern phenomenon that grew out of a storm in the winter of 69. Has nothing to do with the first century. The difficulty is that the frontier changed. In Jesus's day, the Jordan River was the frontier between Galilee and the area of Golanitis, east of the Jordan. That was a geopolitical divide. In Jesus's day, Bethsaida was never in the Galilee. However, after the revolt, or in the time of the revolt, 66 to 70, and afterwards, that line of distinction evaporated, particularly under Agrippa. Agrippa II, that distinction between those two regions fell away, and we actually have both in Pliny and a geographer who describes Julius being in Galilee. That means that those borders between those regions changed, and people spoke generally about the Galilee extending also to the east side. So what's going on in John's Gospel, he's writing later in the first century. In his day, if I can say it, in his day, Bethsaida Julius was in the Galilee, but not in Jesus's day. History causes changes on things. The example I usually give for that, a parallel, is in Genesis 21. You have the story of Abraham at Beersheba, and at the end of the story, it says they returned to the land of the Philistines. There were no Philistines in the land during Abraham's day. That description doesn't match the period that's being described. It belongs to the period of the author. The author is giving a contemporary reference. That's exactly what's happening in John's Gospel. In John's Gospel, in John's day, the distinction between Golanitis and Galilee that distinction had been minimized. He's not making a mistake. He's giving a contemporary reference, but the reference doesn't pertain to the time when Jesus was there. In Jesus' day, Galilee was in Golanitis, as Josephus describes, and only later when those lines were raised. What?
Bethsaida was in the Golan, not the Galilee.
Yeah.
So what did I say?
You said Galilee was in Golan.
Oh, sorry. That's all right. But anyhow, it's not I've never tried to bend the Jordan in order to, you have to address this stuff very seriously. And, sometimes you can answer questions, sometimes you can't answer the questions, but this one I think is quite easily dealt with.
I just add that Josephus was the governor of Galilee and Golan. But at least twice in his book, he says that he was the governor of Galilee. For him, the Golan, which is part of his land, is part of Galilee. Not always. He divided it to Galilee and he ruled the entire area. That's another example.
Very nice. I like that one.
Yeah.
I'm going to quote you.
Thank you for addressing that, because we talked about that earlier, and I think it is definitely important to realize when, are these authors writing this, like John's gospel was written decades after. And so we can sort of understand the borders would have been a little bit more open, I guess, and not as strictly divided. You mentioned that under the church, you found like potential like walls for settlement of first century Jewish homes. I was curious what specific time period that house is designated to, and what kind of things you found around that structure.
First of all, the houses, the walls that we dug under the apse, so it's a very small area, but the walls are very clear and the layers are clear. The lowest wall is 1st, 2nd century. The upper wall is 2nd, 3rd century, and that's exactly the same layers we have in the other Roman layers. We have 2 phases of the Roman housing system developed. It's not that something happened, but they developed in these 2 periods. We date the walls according to the pottery we find at the bottom of the walls, in the foundation trenches or the base of the walls. And it is very clear that the lower wall is 1st, 2nd, and the next one is 2nd, 3rd century. In the 4th century, there is a series of walls that enclosed the earlier walls, and the 5th century church was built over this. And we assume that should be checked in the coming seasons. But what we have here is an early Christian religious site before the church was built. And that's happened in Capernaum, that's happened in Tabgha, that there is a late 4th, early 5th century structure before the big church was built. So we have here, now we've tried to rebuild the story. We have a late Hellenistic Hasmonean Jewish settlement developing into a large Jewish village in the 1st century. Came a small polis in the late 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries, disappeared, abandoned, I assume because of problems of level of the lake. And in the 4th century, people were searching for the holy places, and the home place of Peter, Andrew, and Philip was important enough to go and identify walls that they have seen on surface. They didn't dig to look for them. There were heaps of ruins on surface, and because the tradition was that this is Bethsaida, they took a group of walls, surrounded them with walls and maybe another upper structure. In the 5th century, they decided to change it and build there a large basilica. That's the story. And the basilica was standing there until the 8th century when Wilbert saw it. After that, probably in the big earthquake of 749, the place was completely abandoned.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm excited to maybe hear more about that as you guys continue to excavate this location. Appreciate you guys coming onto the show and sharing just your insights. It's been really fascinating to hear about this site and maybe clear some things up as well. Would love to hear about how people can learn more about your dig and learn more about you both.
Come to Israel.
Yeah.
Summer, come to visit us.
Come to
End of July, beginning of August, we are there in the 40 degrees centigrade.
Yeah, the website we're in the process of updating and developing. We've changed our domain name. It previously was El-Araj excavations.com, but this summer we're in the process of upgrading and changing the domain BethsaidaJulius.com. So we're nailing our colors to the mast, as it were. So people stay tuned, keep checking back and for updates, but usually we use it to include everything in terms of lectures, recordings, articles, interviews, things that show up. We try to include links there.
In a few months, 4 or 5 months, we'll have the first preliminary report of the first 5 seasons. Will be out in English, and people could get it on the stores, on the web, wherever it will be. And they can visit the website.
Thank you for listening to Truth and Tradition. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to check out my previous talk with Rami Arav for a different perspective regarding Bethsaida. As always, I'd like to end things off with a quote from the screenwriter of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusader. Jeffrey Boehm writes, "Archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. So forget any idea you've got about lost cities, exotic travel, and digging up the world. We do not follow maps to buried treasure, and X never, ever marks the spot. 70% of all archaeology is done in the library, research, and reading." Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep on seeking.